The terminal was alive with the usual morning rush. Rolling suitcases clattered across the floor. Travelers sipped coffee. Flight numbers echoed over the speakers. At Gate 17, the line hadn't formed yet. A few passengers lingered nearby, scrolling their phones, waiting for the call to board. Through the crowd walked Dorian Brandt. His suit was sharp, his shoes polished and his steps steady, like a man who had done this routine many times before. In one hand, he carried a dark leather garment bag. In the other, a first-class boarding pass for San Francisco. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't looking for attention. He just wanted to board his flight. He gave a polite nod to the young gate agent and handed over his ticket. She didn't scan it right away. Instead, her eyes lingered on him a little too long, as if she was trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She looked down at the boarding pass, then back up at him. Once, then again. "This lane is for premium passengers only," she said firmly, her tone sharper than the moment called for. "I know," Dorian replied, calm as ever. The words should have been enough. The ticket in his hand said everything. But she didn't press the scanner. Her hesitation stretched out in silence until she leaned toward a coworker and whispered. The second woman peeked over her shoulder, glancing at Dorian as if he were a problem to solve. Then came the request. "I'm going to need to see some ID." Dorian tilted his head slightly. "You don't usually ask for ID when scanning a boarding pass. Is there a problem?" Her answer was stiff. "It's just a security measure." He knew better. There was no such rule here. Still, he pulled out his wallet and handed her his license. She held it awkwardly, not scanning anything, not moving forward, just stalling. Finally, she set it down on the desk and muttered, "Wait here for a moment." Dorian glanced at the pass. His name was clear, Dorian Brandt. He didn't say a word. He didn't move. He just waited. A man in a dark uniform walked toward the desk. Security. No questions, no explanation. Just eyes on Dorian like he was a checklist to be evaluated. The officer stood near him, silent but present, close enough to signal suspicion. Behind them, passengers began to notice. A businessman in a gray pullover leaned toward another traveler and whispered, "Is he causing trouble?" A woman with a floral carry-on craned her neck, watching the scene unfold. Murmurs spread. People pulled out their phones, checking the flight status, trying to guess what the delay was. But Dorian didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. One calm motion. He pressed a number, lifted it to his ear, and spoke in a low, steady tone. "It's me. I need you to pull up the catering contract we signed with Horizon Air 2 weeks ago, the one covering their western routes." "Yes, I'm standing at JFK Gate 17. I'll hold." His eyes stayed forward. His posture was still. There was no trace of anger, no panic, just quiet control. Around him, the atmosphere shifted. The gate agent whispered again to her colleague, glancing nervously at the security officer who still hadn't spoken. Passengers behind him grew restless, shifting their weight, checking watches, muttering about the holdup. The call wasn't long. "Got it," came the voice on the other end. "Do you want me to call corporate?" "Just flag it," Dorian answered softly. "I think they're about to realize there's a problem." He ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. The boarding pass was still in his hand, his ID still on the desk. To anyone watching, it looked like a man waiting patiently for a minor inconvenience to be sorted out. But that single call was not minor. That call carried the weight of a $48 million contract. A contract that tied his company directly to the very airline whose staff had just decided he didn't belong in first class. Dorian didn't explain it. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, silent, calm, immovable. And that silence was more powerful than any argument could have been, because what no one at the gate realized yet was that this man, the one they were holding back, wasn't just a passenger. He was someone who held in his pocket the ability to stop an entire airline in its tracks, and he had just made the call to do it. The minutes stretched longer than they should have. Dorian stood quietly off to the side, his boarding pass still in hand, his ID still resting untouched on the counter. Around him, the small group of passengers waiting nearby began to grow uneasy. Some shifted from foot to foot. Others stole quick glances at him as if trying to guess what the problem could be. The young gate agent avoided his eyes now. She typed aimlessly on her keyboard, tapping keys that didn't seem to lead anywhere. Every so often she looked at her coworker, whispering under her breath. The second woman glanced at Dorian but quickly turned away as if she didn't want to be caught staring. The air felt heavier, the kind of heaviness that doesn't come from the weather or the crowded terminal, but from the unspoken message hanging between people. He doesn't belong here. The security officer stood close enough to make his presence clear. He didn't ask questions. He didn't check the boarding pass. He just watched Dorian, arms crossed, waiting. His expression wasn't hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was the expression of someone who had already made up his mind before hearing a single word. Dorian stayed calm. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing even. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. He had learned a long time ago that sometimes silence carried more weight than words. Behind him, the murmurs grew louder. A businessman in a gray pullover leaned toward a woman with a floral bag and whispered, "What's going on? Is he in the wrong line?" The woman shrugged, glancing at Dorian again before answering, "Maybe he doesn't have the right ticket." Neither of them knew, but their voices carried just enough for Dorian to hear. He didn't turn. He didn't react. He had heard those kinds of comments before. In boardrooms, in hotels, in restaurants where people assumed he was staff instead of a guest. And now, here at Gate 17, the same story played out again. The gate agent leaned into her headset, muttering something about a situation at the desk. Her voice was low, but the words made Dorian smile faintly. To her, this was a situation. To him, it was routine. Not new, not shocking. Just another reminder that sometimes the suit you wear doesn't erase the assumptions people carry. Passengers shuffled closer to the gate, anxious for boarding to start. Some looked annoyed at the delay, others curious, a few impatient. One man pulled out his phone and pretended to check emails, but his camera pointed just a little too high, catching pieces of the scene. The whispers multiplied, feeding on each other until it felt like the whole terminal was buzzing with speculation. Dorian's phone call still echoed in his mind. It hadn't been dramatic, not loud enough for anyone nearby to notice, but it was enough to set things in motion far beyond Gate 17. He didn't need to announce who he was. He didn't need to defend himself to strangers in line. The weight of that contract, the $48 million tied directly to his company, would speak louder than anything he could say here. The gate agent returned to the counter, still avoiding eye contact. She tapped at her keyboard again, this time pretending to check his booking. Her coworker leaned over and whispered sharply, "What exactly is the issue?" The agent shook her head, voice low but firm. "It just doesn't feel right." That sentence hung in the air, heavier than any boarding pass. It doesn't feel right. A phrase that had nothing to do with policy or procedure. It wasn't about the ticket or the ID or the rules. It was about her assumption, the quiet belief that he couldn't possibly belong where he was standing. Dorian remained still. He wasn't going to give her the performance she might have been expecting. No anger, no raised voice, no scene for others to point at and say, "See?" Instead, he let the silence build. His calmness made the space around him even more tense, because it threw everyone else's unease into sharp relief. The security officer shifted his weight, glancing at the agent as if waiting for instructions. She whispered again, her tone clipped, nervous now. The officer nodded but stayed in place. Passengers began asking questions openly. "Why aren't we boarding yet? Is there a delay? What's happening?" The agent cleared her throat and spoke into the microphone, forcing cheer into her voice. "We're just working through a minor issue. Thank you for your patience," but no one was patient. The businessman in the gray pullover sighed loudly, shaking his head. A woman with headphones pulled them off and asked, "What's the holdup?" "We're supposed to be boarding." Another passenger muttered, "It's always something with this airline." The tension spread, not just around Dorian, but through the entire waiting area. He stood there, quiet, steady, and unshaken. The longer the delay stretched, the clearer it became that the real problem wasn't him at all. The problem was the doubt they had created out of nothing, and the storm that doubt was now beginning to cause. And somewhere above the terminal, in offices far removed from the boarding gate, his quiet phone call was already beginning to ripple through the airline's chain of command. Dorian stood quietly at the gate, waiting, his posture steady and unshaken. But behind that calm face was a lifetime of stories that explained why he could stand so tall in moments like this. He hadn't always worn tailored suits or carried first-class tickets. Long before the contracts and boardrooms, long before anyone knew his name, Dorian was just a boy from Mansfield, Ohio. His family's house was small, its wooden floors soft from years of footsteps. Mornings were loud with the sound of his mother Eunice getting ready for her shift at the grocery store. She worked the produce section, stacking apples, checking melons, helping customers pick the best fruit for their families. His father, Leonard, often came home just as the sun was rising, still tired from long nights at the steel mill. When he wasn't at the mill, he was fixing cars for neighbors, making sure there was always food on the table. They didn't have much, but what they lacked in money they made up for in lessons. His mother taught him the value of patience and presentation. She'd hold up an apple and say, "People don't just buy food, they buy trust. If you can make them trust you, they'll come back." His father taught him grit. Even on his worst days, Leonard never complained. He just worked harder. By 15, Dorian was already up before sunrise on Saturdays, helping his mother sort crates of produce before the grocery store opened. He could tell a ripe cantaloupe by touch, a spoiled tomato by smell. More importantly, he learned how to talk to people. Not at them, but to them. There's a difference, he realized, and it mattered. Those lessons stuck. By the time he finished college at Kent State with a degree in agricultural business, he carried with him not just a diploma, but a vision. He wanted to do more than sell food. He wanted to change the way food was grown, delivered, and trusted. At 23, he started small. A roadside produce stand just outside Columbus. Nothing fancy. Just a borrowed pickup, a folding table, a tent, and crates of sweet corn stacked like treasure. He stood there day after day, rain or shine, talking to customers, telling them where the food came from and why it mattered. Slowly, people came back. They trusted him. It wasn't glamorous. He worked alone, hauling crates, driving miles to farms, setting up in parking lots. But he was learning. He was building. Every sale, every handshake was another brick in a foundation he didn't even realize he was laying. In his early 30s, the real shift happened. While bigger companies were busy cutting corners with industrial farms and frozen supply chains, Dorian noticed something others didn't. People were beginning to care where their food came from. Not just farmers, market shoppers, but everyday families. They wanted produce that was fresh, grown responsibly, and still affordable. He saw the gap and he jumped in. He created Brandt Global Foods out of a rented garage and an old laptop that crashed more times than he could count. His idea was simple but powerful. Connect local farms directly with grocery chains, universities, and eventually airlines without sacrificing quality. No middlemen, no shortcuts. Just good food, fast delivery, and fair prices. The road wasn't easy. For years, big players ignored him. Some even laughed. But he kept at it, building connections farm by farm, deal by deal. He drove his own delivery routes, slept in his truck some nights, and poured every dollar back into the business. 15 years later, the laughter stopped. His company wasn't a garage startup anymore. Brandt Global Foods supplied over 30 major grocery chains, 5 large universities, and most recently, Horizon Air. The very airline now questioning whether he belonged in first class had come to him asking for help. Their food service had been falling apart, plagued by bad press and angry passengers. Horizon needed a fresh start, and Dorian gave them a plan. Seasonal rotations, farm-to-airline sourcing, packaging that cut waste in half. They signed a contract worth $48 million. But even with all the success, Dorian never changed. Walk into his office in Dayton and you wouldn't see walls covered in awards or magazine covers. Instead, you'd find an old photo of his roadside stand and a wall lined with thank you notes from farmers. That was Dorian. Quiet, grounded, always remembering where he came from. He didn't boast about power. He simply used it when it mattered. And that morning at JFK, standing at Gate 17 with security watching him like a threat, he wasn't just a man waiting for a flight. He was a man who carried decades of work, resilience, and quiet strength in his pocket. The gate agent didn't know that. The passengers whispering behind him didn't know that. But the phone call he had just made would make sure the right people were reminded very quickly of exactly who Dorian Brandt was, because he wasn't simply holding a boarding pass. He was holding the future of their airline in his hands. Dorian stood a few steps back from the boarding lane, his boarding pass still in one hand, his phone resting silent again in the other. To most people watching, it looked like nothing. A man on a call. A routine delay. But what had just happened in that brief conversation was anything but routine. He hadn't called to complain. He hadn't called to demand attention. He had simply connected one line of business with another. That phone call wasn't about raising his voice. It was about raising the stakes. The gate agent, Haley, tried to look busy at her desk, but her fingers shook as she tapped at the keyboard. The system didn't show anything wrong with his ticket because nothing was wrong with it. Yet she kept clicking, as if somewhere hidden in the lines of text on her screen, she could find an excuse for the doubt she already carried. Beside her, her co-worker Mia lowered her voice. "What are we doing here? His pass is valid. Why are you stalling?" Haley stiffened. "It just doesn't feel right. Those words again. A feeling. An assumption. Not rules. Not facts." Just her discomfort turned into an obstacle. The security officer lingered near Dorian, shifting his stance, watching him like someone studying a puzzle piece that didn't fit. He still hadn't said a word. That silence was its own message, an unspoken suspicion that made the space heavier with each passing minute. Meanwhile, passengers in line grew louder. Some leaned over the ropes to see what was happening. A man near the front whispered, "Why is first class not boarding yet?" A woman behind him muttered, "This airline is unbelievable. Always something." Dorian didn't move. His stillness was almost unsettling in its control. The more the whispers spread, the calmer he seemed, as if he were the only one not feeling the weight of the delay. But beneath that calm, threads were already being pulled. Upstairs, in the operations offices above the terminal, an alert popped onto a regional manager's screen. A flagged note from Brandt Global Foods. Just a few lines of text, but urgent enough to get immediate attention. Client representative reports potential escalation at JFK Gate 17 involving Horizon Air contract holder Dorian Brandt. The name landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples across desks and phones. Within minutes, calls were being made. Directors were looped in. Legal teams were quietly informed. No one in the terminal knew it yet, but that single phone call had set off an internal alarm louder than any boarding announcement. Back at the gate, Mia leaned in again, whispering sharply, "Do you know who that is?" "That's Dorian Brandt. His company just signed with us. I saw the memo last week." Haley's face drained of color. "Wait, what?" Mia nodded, her voice urgent. "He supplies Horizon's new food program. The multi-million-dollar deal? That's him." Haley glanced back at Dorian, who was now standing near the glass wall overlooking the runway, his posture as steady as ever. He wasn't glaring. He wasn't scowling. He was just waiting, which somehow made it worse. Panic crept up her spine. She had turned this into something it never should have been, and the man she had turned it against was not just another passenger. She pressed her headset tighter, whispering into the mic, "I need backup at Gate 17, passenger issue. Just make sure someone higher is aware." Her voice trembled, though she tried to keep it even. Passengers noticed the tension now. A man with a navy blazer leaned toward another and asked, "Is this going to take long? I've got a connection in Chicago." A woman behind them tapped impatiently on her phone, shaking her head. The murmurs were louder, sharper, spilling through the gate area. Dorian stayed by the window, hands folded loosely behind his back, watching the luggage carts move across the runway. His phone rested quietly in his pocket again. He knew better than to force the moment. He knew the weight of silence, because silence makes people fill the gaps on their own. And right now, everyone at that gate was filling the gaps with their own assumptions. Haley's doubt, the passenger's frustration, the officer's suspicion. But somewhere above them, in offices they couldn't see, his silence had already turned into noise. Meetings were being interrupted. Names were being spoken with urgency, and every second that ticked by was pulling more attention toward Gate 17. Haley tried to steady herself, but Mia's words echoed in her ears. "That's Dorian Brandt." She had no way to undo the steps she'd taken, the ID check that wasn't needed, the whisper to security, the delay she couldn't explain. Each move had stacked into a wall she couldn't climb back down from. And Dorian? He didn't need to lift a brick. His one quiet phone call was already doing the work for him. What Haley didn't know, what no one in that waiting area knew, was that while she struggled to hold on to control, the airline itself was starting to lose it. Executives were leaving their desks. Directors were being pulled into urgent calls. Legal teams were flipping through files, and all of it traced back to the calm man at Gate 17 who had said almost nothing, but had set an entire system in motion. 10 floors above the terminal, in a glass-walled office that overlooked the runways, the hum of routine work was interrupted. Cynthia Reyes, the airline's director of regional operations, was halfway through a quarterly report and a croissant when her desk phone lit up with a call marked urgent. She almost didn't answer. It was an unknown number, but the call had been redirected twice and flagged by her assistant. "This is Cynthia," she said, voice brisk. On the other end was a calm but firm voice. "Hi, Cynthia, this is Maggie Geller. I'm calling on behalf of Dorian Brandt, CEO of Brandt Global Foods. There's been an incident at JFK Gate 17. Cynthia sat up straighter, her pen frozen in midair. "What kind of incident?" "Your staff is detaining him at the gate despite his first-class ticket." "We're concerned it may escalate," Maggie said evenly. Cynthia's eyes sharpened. She knew the name. Everyone at Horizon Air did. Brandt Global was not just another supplier. They were the supplier. The key to rebuilding the airline's food service reputation after years of bad press. His company wasn't a side partner. He was the centerpiece of their new campaign. Cynthia didn't waste time asking for more details. She grabbed her jacket, stood up, and waved for her assistant. "Clear my schedule. I'm going to the gate." Her heels clicked hard against the tile as she hurried down the hall, already dialing 2 other numbers. "Get Sean from Operations and Elise from Brand Protection. Now. Meet me at Gate 17. Meanwhile, across the country in Minneapolis, Horizon's corporate headquarters buzzed with another call. Jack Renault, head of food service integration, was in the middle of a working lunch when his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, saw Maggie's name, and answered. "Jack, it's Maggie. Dorian's being stopped at JFK. Horizon staff flagged him for no reason." Jack nearly dropped his fork. "You've got to be kidding me." "No." He called it in personally. Jack pushed his chair back, standing. "I'll get Cynthia on it. She's already moving," Maggie replied. "You might want to prep legal." Just in case, Jack didn't answer. He just hung up and immediately dialed his contacts. If this story got out, it could undo months of careful planning. Horizon had lined up press releases, promotional videos, and an entire fall initiative with Dorian as the face of modern food sustainability. And right now that face was being sidelined at a boarding gate like an unwanted guest. Back in New York, Cynthia's presence at Gate 17 sent a visible ripple through the crowd. Passengers glanced up as she arrived, her sharp suit and confident stride making it clear she wasn't just another traveler. The gate agent, Haley, froze as Cynthia approached, her throat dry. Behind her, Mia whispered under her breath, "Oh no." Cynthia's eyes swept the scene. Dorian standing calmly by the window, the security officer stiff at his side, the restless passengers muttering about delays. She didn't need anyone to explain. She already knew this was a disaster. "Mr. Brandt?" Cynthia said as she extended her hand, her voice calm but direct. "I'm Cynthia Reyes, Director of Operations. May I speak with you privately?" Dorian turned his head slightly. He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "Of course." They stepped a few feet away from the desk where Cynthia lowered her voice. "On behalf of Horizon Air, I want to apologize. I've already contacted our internal team to review what happened. This should not have occurred. I'd like to personally escort you on board." Dorian's expression didn't change. "Do you know what seat I was assigned?" She glanced at her tablet. "Seat 1A, he gave a faint smile. "First row? Interesting. I was told this lane was for premium passengers only." Cynthia swallowed hard. "Again, I apologize," but Dorian leaned in slightly, his tone still even. "The issue isn't the mistake, Miss Reyes, it's the assumption behind it." Her chest tightened. There were no words that could soften the truth in his statement. Behind them, Haley stood at the desk, her hands trembling as she adjusted her headset. She could feel the stares of passengers burning into her. Some were whispering, others recording discreetly on their phones. She had tried to hold her ground, but the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Just then, another figure arrived, a tall man with sandy hair and a black lanyard. Justin Cole, Horizon's legal liaison for the East Coast. He had been briefed in the elevator and approached with caution, extending his hand. "Mr. Brandt, I'd like to apologize personally. I understand this has been..." Dorian cut him off gently. "I don't need an apology, Mr. Cole. I need you to explain how something like this happens. After we sign a $48 million deal, Justin froze, his words evaporating. There was no script for this. Passengers nearby had gone quiet, their curiosity sharpening into attention. The weight of the moment pressed down on the gate like heavy air. Everyone could feel it, even if they didn't understand the details. Cynthia stepped in quickly. "Mr. Brandt, we understand the seriousness of the situation. We're reviewing staff conduct and training procedures. This isn't a reflection of our company's values." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "You mean it's not a reflection of the company's values, or not a reflection of the gate agent's judgment?" Cynthia's throat tightened. She didn't answer. The truth hung in the air, undeniable. The calm man they had underestimated had turned silence into a mirror, and now the company was being forced to look at its own reflection. The air around Gate 17 felt like it had thickened, as if everyone was holding their breath at once. The murmurs had died down, replaced by a quiet attention. Even those who didn't understand what was happening could sense it wasn't just a boarding delay anymore. Something bigger was unfolding. Dorian stood calmly, still holding his boarding pass, while Cynthia Reyes tried to steady the weight of the situation. She had already apologized, already offered to escort him, but Dorian hadn't given her the comfort of acceptance. He wasn't angry, but his silence carried something heavier than anger: disappointment. Justin Cole, the legal liaison, shifted uncomfortably beside them. He was used to finding the right words in difficult moments, but here, words felt useless. He glanced at Cynthia, hoping she'd take the lead, but she was studying Dorian's face, trying to read what he hadn't yet said. Finally, Dorian spoke, his voice low and even. "You see, Miss Reyes, this isn't about a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. It's about the assumption that I didn't belong where my ticket said I belonged. That assumption has a cost." Cynthia nodded quickly. "We understand, and I assure you we're taking it very seriously." Dorian tilted his head slightly, his calm expression unchanging. "Do you? Because if you did, I wouldn't be standing here explaining it. The cost isn't just to me. It's to your company, to your passengers, to your reputation. People are watching, and what they see tells them more about you than it does about me." The words weren't harsh. They weren't shouted, but they hit harder than anything loud could have. A woman in line leaned toward her friend and whispered, "Who is this guy?" Her friend shook her head, wide-eyed, as if to say, "Whoever he is, he's important." Cynthia swallowed, her throat tight. "Mr. Brandt, on behalf of Horizon Air, I want to make this right." Dorian reached into his garment bag and pulled out a thin folder. He held it casually, not waving it like a threat, but offering it like a simple reminder. "Do you know what this is?" Cynthia took it with careful hands, though she already guessed. Inside was a signed copy of the contract. Brandt Global Foods, $48 million. Produce, packaging, logistics. The future of Horizon's food program. "This isn't just paperwork," Dorian said quietly. "This is your brand. So when your staff looked at me and saw a problem instead of a passenger, they didn't just question me. They questioned the very face of the change you claim to be making." The gate agent, Haley, stood frozen behind the desk. She felt the sting of his words, even though they weren't directed at her by name. She fiddled with her headset, her face pale, her eyes darting between the floor and the crowd. Mia, beside her, whispered softly, "He's right." Passengers were silent now, phones in their hands but lowered, watching with a mixture of awe and unease. No one dared to speak above the weight of the moment. Justin finally stepped forward, his voice measured. "Mr. Brandt, we're prepared to issue a formal apology, public or private. Whatever you prefer." Dorian turned his eyes toward him, his voice still calm. "You think I'm here for an apology? Do you believe that fixes the assumption? A tweet, a statement? That won't change what happened to me, and it won't stop it from happening to the next person." The silence afterward was heavy, stretching across the gate area until even the passengers felt it pressing against their chests. Cynthia exhaled slowly. "Then what would you like, Mr. Brandt?" Dorian's gaze flicked briefly toward Haley. She looked down immediately, clutching her badge with trembling fingers. He didn't glare at her. He didn't scold her. He didn't even speak to her. He just looked, with an expression that wasn't anger but something worse: disappointment. When he turned back to Cynthia, his words were simple. "I want better. Not for me. For the next person. Because they may not have a phone call they can make." The line cut deep. A few passengers nodded unconsciously, as if he had spoken for more than himself. Cynthia felt the weight of his request. This wasn't something she could handle with paperwork. This wasn't about one man. This was about the reflection of an entire airline in the eyes of its customers and in the silence of its mistakes. She gave a small nod. Understood. With that, she gestured to the crew to clear the lane. The boarding doors were unblocked. Dorian stepped forward at last, his boarding pass scanned without hesitation. But he didn't move quickly. He walked at the same calm pace he had maintained all morning, as if proving his point with every step. Passengers followed his movement with their eyes, some whispering, others silent. The murmurs weren't about frustration anymore. They were about respect. As Dorian disappeared down the jet bridge, Haley finally let out a shaky breath, her knees weak. Mia leaned close, her voice low but sharp. Do you understand what just happened? That man's company supplies half the food we serve in first class, and you treated him like he didn't belong here. Haley didn't answer. She couldn't, because deep down she already knew. The jet bridge was quiet, a stark contrast to the murmurs he left behind at Gate 17. As Dorian stepped onto the plane, the flight attendants were already waiting. Their usual practice smiles were softer this time, almost apologetic. Good morning, Mr. Brandt, one of them said gently, reaching for his garment bag. Another offered a bottle of water without him asking. Their gestures weren't scripted, they were acknowledgments. Quiet apologies in their own way. Dorian accepted the water, set it down untouched, and sank into seat 1A. He exhaled through his nose, not relief, not frustration, just breath. Controlled, measured, the way he had learned to carry himself after a lifetime of moments like this. Outside the window, the airport kept moving. Luggage carts rolled past. Fuel trucks lined up. But inside Horizon's system, something was shifting. In a secure conference room above the terminal, Cynthia Reyes was already on a call with the legal team and human resources. Internal reviews had been triggered, gate logs pulled, staff notes flagged. Flights nearby were quietly delayed, not because of technical issues, but because the company wanted to contain the fallout. Down at the gate, Haley was escorted away discreetly. No announcement, no scene. Her name wouldn't appear on the schedule the next day. The passengers didn't know the details, but they knew something had changed. A photo had already been snapped of Dorian standing calm by the window, phone in hand, with a caption spreading online. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move, but the whole airport listened. On board, the captain made an announcement about a short delay due to operational coordination. Most passengers groaned. A man a few rows back muttered, "Figures. This airline never gets it together." But Dorian didn't react. He closed his eyes for a moment, his posture steady, his face unreadable. He thought of his father, Leonard, who once had been turned away from a car dealership because the manager assumed he couldn't afford the vehicle. He thought of his first investor meeting, when someone mistook him for the valet. And now, here he was, decades later, still facing the same questions in different forms, not because of what he lacked, but because of what others couldn't imagine. A flight attendant named Jordan returned quietly. "Mr. Brandt," he said softly, "I saw what happened out there. It wasn't right." Dorian opened his eyes. Jordan hesitated, then added, "Last year, my younger brother watched your talk at the Sustainability Summit. He's studying agritions now. You made it feel real for him. Just thought you should know." For the first time since arriving at the airport, Dorian smiled. Small, genuine, human. "I appreciate that," he said simply. The rest of the flight passed in silence. When they finally landed in San Francisco, the passengers rushed off quickly, eager for taxis and connections. Dorian moved slowly, not because of fatigue, but because he didn't rush for anyone. His phone buzzed with messages. Maggie letting him know legal had drafted letters, reporters sniffing for details, and one link to a small blog already writing about the JFK incident. He ignored them all. At the conference hall, the ballroom buzzed with chatter. Attendees didn't mention the airport, they didn't need to. Dorian wouldn't have entertained it anyway. When he took the stage for his keynote, he didn't speak of boarding passes or delays. Instead, he spoke of resilience in supply chains, of how small assumptions in food sourcing could create big consequences for millions of people. But near the end, he paused. His gaze swept across the room, steady and thoughtful. Then he said, "Sometimes the problem isn't the system. Sometimes it's the shortcuts we take in reading people. Whether it's a new grower, a supplier, or someone standing in line with a valid boarding pass, what we assume tells the world more about us than it does about them. The applause was quiet but real. Not thunderous, not rehearsed. Just genuine. Afterward, as Dorian stepped off stage, a man from a Seattle distribution firm stopped him. "That line you said about shortcuts, it hit harder than I thought it would." Dorian gave him a small smile. "That's where the rot starts, in the shortcuts." Back in New York, Cynthia filed her report late into the night. Haley's file had been flagged. Policies were being reviewed. New training programs were drafted in meetings that stretched for weeks. Official statements were polished but never released publicly, because Dorian never asked for them. He didn't demand a press tour. He didn't want to be a headline. When GQ reached out for an interview, Maggie asked if she should schedule it. Dorian shook his head. "Tell them I'm busy feeding people," and that was it. Weeks passed, then months. The story never went viral. There were no hashtags, no trending videos, but it lingered. People who were in the terminal that morning told the story at dinner tables. Staff at Horizon whispered about it in break rooms. Gate agents began second-guessing their instincts, pausing before reaching for a headset, wondering if the person in front of them deserved the benefit of the doubt. And somewhere in Ohio, Eunice Brandt sat at her kitchen table, reading an article about the quiet incident at JFK. She smiled, folded the paper, and whispered to herself, "That's my son. Sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all."